German tourist vanished from Thai resort in 1999. Video revealed in 2023. Changed the case. The fog rolled in thick that July morning in 1999, wrapping around the jagged cliffs of Northern California's Lost Coast like a gray shroud. Rebecca Matthews stood at the edge of the wooden deck, her coffee growing cold in her trembling hands as she watched the Pacific Ocean disappear into the mist. At 28 years old, she had never felt more alone, more desperate for peace than she did in this moment. The Seaside Haven Lodge sat perched on a remote stretch of coastline, accessible only by a winding dirt road that snaked through towering redwoods and coastal scrub. Rebecca had found this place through a worn travel guide in a used bookstore back in Sacramento, drawn by the promise of complete isolation and natural tranquility. The lodge's rustic cabins were scattered across 5 acres of windswept bluffs, connected by meandering paths lined with wild lupine and seagrass. 3 weeks, that's all she needed. 3 weeks to figure out what came next after the divorce papers were signed, after the life she'd built with David crumbled into bitter accusations and sleepless nights. 3 weeks to remember who she was before she became half of a failing marriage. The lodge owner, Martha Henley, had welcomed Rebecca with the kind of warm smile that belonged to a woman who'd seen her share of broken hearts seeking refuge in these remote hills. Martha was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and hands weathered by decades of coastal living. Her husband, Tom, managed the maintenance and daily operations, while their small staff of seasonal workers kept the lodge, running through the busy summer months. "You'll find what you're looking for here, dear," Martha had said as she handed Rebecca the key to Cabin 7, the most secluded of their accommodations. "The ocean has a way of washing away what needs to. Go and bringing clarity to what matters." Rebecca's cabin sat at the far end of the property, a 20-minute walk from the main lodge through a trail that wound between ancient Sitka spruces. The structure itself was simple but charming. Rough-hewn cedar walls, a stone fireplace, and large windows that framed the endless expanse of ocean beyond. Inside, she'd arranged her belongings with careful precision, her camera equipment on the small desk by the window, her journal and art supplies on the nightstand, and her clothes hung neatly in the cedar wardrobe. She'd come here to heal, to process the pain of watching her marriage dissolve despite years of trying to save it. David had wanted children immediately, had pushed for the suburban house with the white picket fence, the dinner parties with neighbors she barely knew. Rebecca had craved adventure, travel, the freedom to chase her photography dreams. And neither of them had been willing to compromise, and their love had slowly suffocated under the weight of incompatible futures. The first 2 days at the lodge had been exactly what she'd hoped for. She'd hiked the coastal trails with her camera, capturing the dramatic interplay of light and shadow as fog rolled in and out of hidden coves. The other guests were few: a retired couple from Portland, a young backpacker from Germany, and a middle-aged writer working on what he claimed would be the next great American novel. Everyone kept to themselves, respecting the unspoken agreement that people came to Seaside Haven to find solitude, not small talk. But on her 3rd morning, something felt different. Rebecca first noticed it during breakfast in the lodge's communal dining room. She was sitting alone at a corner table, sketching seabirds in her journal while sipping her 2nd cup of coffee, when she became aware of being watched. The sensation started as a gentle prickle at the back of her neck, the kind of awareness that made her look up from her work and scan the room. That's when she saw him. He was standing by the kitchen door, wearing the forest green polo shirt that marked him as lodge staff, medium height, probably in his early 30s, with sandy brown hair and the kind of unremarkable features that would make him forgettable in a crowd. But it was his eyes that made Rebecca uncomfortable. They had a focused intensity that seemed to take in every detail of her appearance, from her paint-stained fingers to the way she'd twisted her auburn hair into a messy bun. When their eyes met, he didn't look away with the polite embarrassment of someone caught staring. Instead, he smiled, a slow, deliberate expression that never quite reached his eyes, and continued watching her until she forced herself to return to her sketching. "That's Jake Morrison," said a voice beside her. Rebecca looked up to see Sarah Chen, the young German backpacker she'd briefly chatted with the day before. Sarah had pulled out the chair across from Rebecca and was settling in with her own breakfast tray. "He started working here about 2 weeks ago. Temporary summer help, according to Martha." Rebecca glanced back toward the kitchen, but Jake had disappeared. "He seemed intense," she said carefully. Sarah nodded, lowering her voice. "I've noticed him watching guests. Yesterday I was reading on the deck, and I looked up to find him standing behind the railing, just staring. When I waved, he acted like he'd been doing maintenance work on the building, but there were no tools or anything." A chill ran down Rebecca's spine, but she tried to rationalize it away. Small places like this probably didn't attract the most polished employees. Maybe Jake was just socially awkward, unused to interacting with guests. Maybe she was reading too much into an innocent moment. "Have you mentioned it to Martha?" Rebecca asked. "I thought about it, but what would I say? Your employee looked at me. It's not like he's done anything wrong." Sarah picked at her scrambled eggs with obvious discomfort. "I'm leaving tomorrow anyway. My visa's about to expire, and I need to get back to Munich." After breakfast, Rebecca decided to explore a new section of coastline she'd spotted from her cabin window. The trail was unmarked and overgrown, clearly not part of the lodge's maintained path system, but it seemed to lead to a secluded cove she was eager to photograph. She packed her camera bag, water bottle, and journal, then set off through the morning mist. The path was more challenging than she'd anticipated, requiring her to scramble over fallen logs and navigate around thick patches of poison oak. But the difficulty only made her more determined. Since the divorce proceedings began, Rebecca had discovered a need to push herself physically, to prove she could handle whatever challenges came her way. After an hour of hiking, the trail emerged onto a crescent-shaped beach, tucked between towering sea stacks. The cove was completely hidden from the lodge, accessible only by the route she'd just taken. Waves crashed against black rocks, sending spray high into the air, while harbor seals lounged on partially submerged boulders 50 yards offshore. Rebecca spent the morning lost in her photography, moving along the tide line to capture the interplay of water and stone from different angles. The creative process helped quiet the anxious thoughts that had been plaguing her since David served the divorce papers 6 months ago. Here, with only the sound of waves and seabirds for company, she could almost believe she'd find her way through this devastating chapter of her life. It was nearly noon when she decided to take a break for lunch. She found a comfortable spot on a piece of driftwood and pulled out the sandwich Martha had packed for her, along with her journal. As she ate, she sketched the scene before her, trying to capture not just the visual details, but the emotional impact of this wild, untouched place. That's when she heard the footsteps. They were coming from the trail behind her, slow and deliberate. Against the loose gravel, Rebecca turned, expecting to see another guest, or perhaps Tom Henley, checking on trail conditions. Instead, Jake Morrison emerged from between the trees, moving with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there. "Beautiful spot," he said, his voice carrying easily over the sound of the waves. "Not many people find this trail." Rebecca felt her muscles tense, though she couldn't say exactly why. Jake was smiling, his hands relaxed at his sides, his posture non-threatening. But something about his sudden appearance in this remote location triggered every instinct she'd developed as a woman traveling alone. "Yes, it's lovely," she replied, keeping her voice neutral. "I should probably head back soon, though. Don't want to get caught on that trail in the dark." "Oh, you've got plenty of time. Sun doesn't set until 8 this time of year." Jake moved closer, his eyes taking in her camera equipment and journal. "You're an artist." "Amateur photographer," Rebecca said, already beginning to pack her things. The isolation that had felt peaceful minutes ago now seemed dangerous. "Martha's, probably wondering where I got to. Martha's in town picking up supplies. Won't be back until evening." Jake's smile widened slightly. "Tom's working on the generator all afternoon. Probably won't even notice you're gone." The casual way he mentioned the whereabouts of the lodge owners sent ice through Rebecca's veins. Why would a temporary employee know Martha's schedule so precisely? Why would he volunteer that information to a guest he barely knew? "Well, I should get back anyway," she said, slinging her camera bag over her shoulder and standing up from the driftwood. "Need to develop some film before dinner. Mind if I walk with you? I was just checking on some storm damage from last week's weather." Jake gestured toward the trail, positioning himself between Rebecca and the path back to the lodge. Rebecca's heart began to race, but she forced herself to remain calm. She was probably overreacting, letting her recent emotional upheaval color her perception of an innocent encounter. Jake worked at the lodge. Of course, he might check on remote areas for maintenance issues. His knowledge of the staff schedules was probably just the result of good communication between employees. But as they started up the trail together, Rebecca found herself hyper-aware of every sound, every movement from the man walking behind her. She kept her pace brisk, hoping to reach the lodge quickly, but Jake seemed determined to maintain a conversation. "So what brings you to our little corner of nowhere?" he asked. "Most people your age want more excitement in their vacations." "Just needed some quiet time," Rebecca replied without turning around. The trail was narrow here, forcing them to walk single file, which meant she couldn't see his face or gauge his intentions. Running away from something? There was something almost playful in his tone, as if he found her discomfort amusing. "Just looking for some peace," she said firmly. "Nothing dramatic." They walked in silence for several minutes, the only sounds being their footsteps on the trail and the distant crash of waves below. Rebecca began to relax slightly, telling herself she'd imagined the threatening undertones in Jake's behavior. Maybe he was just lonely, starved for conversation after working in such an isolated place, but then she heard him stop walking. She turned to find Jake standing motionless about 10 feet behind her, his head tilted slightly as if listening for something. His entire demeanor had changed. Gone was the casual friendliness, replaced by an alertness that reminded Rebecca of a predator sensing prey. "Is everything okay?" she asked, fighting to keep the fear out of her voice. Jake's eyes met hers, and for just a moment, she saw something cold and calculating behind his pleasant expression. Then the mask slipped back into place, and he was smiling again. "Just thought I heard something in the brush. Probably just a deer." He resumed walking, but Rebecca noticed he'd closed the distance between them. These woods can be dangerous if you don't know them well. Easy to get lost, especially when the fog rolls in. They reached the lodge grounds. 20 minutes later, and Rebecca felt a surge of relief at the sight of the familiar buildings. But her comfort was short-lived when she realized how empty the place appeared. Jake had been right. Martha's truck was gone from the parking area, and there was no sign of Tom or any other staff members. "Looks like we've got the place to ourselves," Jake observed, his voice carrying a note that made Rebecca's skin crawl. "I think I'll rest in my cabin for a while," she said quickly, already heading toward the trail that led to cabin 7. "Sweet dreams," Jake called after her, and something in his tone made her quicken her pace until she was nearly running. Once inside her cabin, Rebecca locked the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding. She told herself she was being paranoid, that Jake's behavior could be explained away as awkward flirtation or social ineptitude. But every instinct she possessed was screaming that something was terribly wrong. She moved to the window that faced toward the main lodge and carefully peered through the curtains. Jake was standing in the parking area, looking directly at her cabin. Even from this distance, she could see he was still smiling. Rebecca spent the rest of the afternoon in her room, trying to read and sketch, but finding it impossible to concentrate. Every small sound outside made her freeze, listening for footsteps on her porch or movement in the surrounding trees. She considered calling the police, but what would she tell them? That an employee had walked with her on a trail and made her uncomfortable, that he'd smiled at her in a way that felt wrong. As evening approached, she heard Martha's truck returning and felt a wash of relief. Surely she'd be safe with the lodge owners present. Maybe she could find a way to casually mention her concerns about Jake without sounding hysterical. But when she made her way to the dining room for dinner, Martha greeted her with troubling news. "I'm so sorry, dear, but we're having generator problems again. Tom's been working on it all day, but I'm afraid we're going to lose power sometime tonight." Martha looked genuinely apologetic as she served Rebecca's meal. "We've got battery-powered lanterns in each cabin, and the emergency lighting should kick in if needed. Hopefully Tom will have it sorted by morning." Rebecca nodded, trying to hide her growing anxiety. A power outage meant darkness, isolation, and limited ability to call for help if something went wrong. She glanced around the dining room, noting that she was the only guest present. "Where is everyone tonight?" she asked. "The German girl checked out this morning and the writer left after lunch. Something about needing better internet access for his research." Martha shrugged. "The retired couple is driving down to San Francisco for a few days. You might be our only guest tonight. What about your staff?" Rebecca tried to sound casual. "Will they be around if I need anything?" "Just Jake tonight. I gave Tom the evening off after all his work on the generator, and our other part-timer called in sick." Martha patted Rebecca's shoulder reassuringly. "But don't worry, dear. Jake's very reliable. He'll be here all night in case of emergencies." Rebecca felt her appetite disappear entirely. She picked at her dinner while Martha bustled around the kitchen, cleaning up and preparing for the next day. When the older woman finally headed home to her cottage on the far side of the property, Rebecca was left alone in the dining room with only the sound of waves and wind for company. She was about to return to her cabin when Jake appeared in the doorway carrying what appeared to be a toolbox. "Just doing some maintenance rounds before the generator goes down," he explained, his smile as unsettling as ever. "Want to make sure everyone's comfortable for the night." "I'm fine, thank you," Rebecca said quickly, moving toward the exit. "Actually, I should probably check the electrical box in your cabin. Make sure the emergency lighting will work if we lose power." Jake stepped aside to let her pass, but the gesture felt more like herding than courtesy. "That won't be necessary. I have the battery lanterns Martha mentioned." "Lodge policy," Jake said firmly. "Safety inspections before any anticipated power outage. Won't take more than a few minutes." Rebecca realized she was trapped. Refusing would only make her seem paranoid and difficult, especially if Jake reported her behavior to Martha. But the thought of being alone in her isolated cabin with this man made her feel physically sick. "Could we do it now, while there's still daylight?" she asked, hoping the remaining natural light would provide some measure of safety. "Of course, let's walk over together." The 10-minute journey to Cabin 7 felt like an eternity. Jake maintained a steady stream of conversation about lodge operations, local wildlife, and the weather, but Rebecca barely heard him. She was too focused on planning escape routes, calculating distances to neighboring cabins, and trying to remember if she'd left anything that could be used as a weapon in her room. When they reached her cabin, Jake insisted on checking both the interior and exterior electrical connections. Rebecca stood in the doorway, ready to run. While he moved efficiently through her living space, she watched in horror as his eyes lingered on her personal belongings. Her journal open on the nightstand, her clothes hanging in the closet, her camera equipment arranged on the desk. "Nice setup," he commented, picking up one of her cameras and examining it closely. "Must be expensive." "It was a graduation gift," Rebecca said tightly, wanting desperately for him to put it down and leave. "From your husband?" Jake's question was casual, but something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Former husband," Rebecca replied without thinking, then immediately regretted revealing personal information. Jake set the camera down and turned to face her fully. "Divorce can be rough. Probably good to get away and clear your head." The fact that he'd guessed her situation so accurately sent chills through Rebecca's entire body. Had Martha mentioned her circumstances to the staff? Or had Jake been paying closer attention to her behavior than she'd realized? "The electrical systems look fine," Jake announced, moving toward the door. "You should be all set for tonight." Rebecca stepped aside to let him pass, but instead of leaving, he paused in the doorway and looked back at her with that same calculating expression she'd seen on the trail. "Sleep well," he said softly. "I'll be around if you need anything." "Anything at all." After he left, Rebecca immediately deadbolted the door and pulled the curtains closed. She sat on her bed with her journal, trying to process the events of the day and decide on her next course of action. Part of her wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but the thought of driving the dark, winding road back to civilization seemed almost as dangerous as staying. Instead, she decided to document everything that had happened, recording Jake's behavior and comments in case she needed to provide details to police later. As she wrote, she tried to be objective, to separate her emotional responses from the actual facts. But even when she stripped away her fear and paranoia, a disturbing pattern remained. Jake had followed her to an isolated location where he shouldn't have had any legitimate business. He'd positioned himself between her and the exit route. He'd demonstrated detailed knowledge of the lodge staff's schedules and movements. He'd insisted on entering her private quarters, despite her obvious discomfort, and throughout it all, he'd maintained that unsettling smile that suggested he was enjoying her fear. Rebecca was so absorbed in her writing that she almost missed the sound of footsteps on her porch. They were slow and deliberate, circling the cabin like someone conducting a careful inspection. Rebecca held her breath, listening as the footsteps paused at each window before moving on to the next. When they reached the front door, they stopped entirely. For long minutes, there was complete silence. Rebecca began to hope that whoever it was had moved on, but then she heard the soft scrape of something metallic against the lock mechanism. Someone was trying to get into her cabin. Rebecca's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. The metallic scraping continued for several more seconds before stopping abruptly. Then came 3 soft knocks on the door. "Rebecca, it's Jake. I wanted to let you know the generator just went down, making sure you're okay in there." His voice sounded perfectly normal, friendly even, but Rebecca's blood turned to ice. She had distinctly heard him trying to manipulate the lock before announcing himself. If he'd simply wanted to check on her welfare, why hadn't he knocked first? "I'm fine, thank you," she called back, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "The battery lanterns are working perfectly. Great, just remember, I'm in the main lodge if you need anything. Don't hesitate to call out if there's an emergency." Rebecca waited until she heard his footsteps retreating before allowing herself to breathe normally again. She moved silently to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains, watching. Jake's flashlight beam bob along the path back toward the main buildings. But instead of continuing to the lodge, the light stopped about halfway there and went out. Her cabin was now surrounded by complete darkness. Rebecca spent the next hour sitting on her bed, fully dressed, listening to every sound outside. Twice, she thought she heard movement in the trees around her cabin, but when she looked out the windows, she saw nothing but black forest. The isolation that had seemed so appealing 3 days ago now felt like a trap. At midnight, exhaustion finally began to outweigh fear. Rebecca had been awake since dawn, and the emotional stress of the day was taking its toll. She decided to try to get some rest, but first she moved the small desk chair under the door handle as an additional barrier. Then she lay down on top of the bed covers, still fully clothed, with her car keys clutched in her hand. She must have dozed off because the next thing she knew, bright sunlight was streaming through the curtains and birds were singing in the trees outside. Rebecca sat up, disoriented and stiff from sleeping in her clothes. For a moment, the events of the previous night seemed like a bad dream, but the chair was still wedged under the door handle and her journal lay open beside her to the pages, where she documented her concerns about Jake. Rebecca dressed quickly and packed her belongings with efficient movements. She was leaving Seaside Haven this morning, 3 weeks early or not. Whatever healing she'd hoped to find here wasn't worth the risk of staying another night. She carried her bags to the car in one trip, eager to avoid multiple walks along the isolated path. The morning air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of salt and pine, but Rebecca barely noticed the beauty around her. She was focused entirely on getting away from this place as quickly as possible. At the main lodge, she found Martha in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for guests who were no longer there. "Rebecca, dear, you're up early. I was just about to bring you some fresh coffee." Martha's warm smile faltered when she saw the luggage. "Oh my, you're not leaving us, are you?" "I'm afraid so. Something's come up back home that requires my immediate attention." The lie came easily, practiced from years of making polite excuses to escape uncomfortable social situations. Oh, what a shame. And after Tom finally got the generator working again. Martha wiped her hands on her apron, looking genuinely disappointed. "I do hope your stay was peaceful, despite the power troubles." "It was lovely," Rebecca said, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. "Could I settle my bill?" As Martha calculated the charges, Rebecca found herself glancing nervously around. The dining room. "Is Jake working this morning? I wanted to thank him for checking on me during the outage." Something flickered across Martha's face. Confusion, perhaps, or concern. "Jake? Dear, I'm afraid Jake left yesterday evening. He said there was a family emergency back in Portland, packed up and drove off right after dinner." Rebecca felt the room spin around her. "But he was here last night. He came to my cabin to check on me when the power went out." Martha set down her pen and studied Rebecca's face carefully. "That's not possible, dear. Jake left around 6 o'clock, right after I got back from town. I saw him load his things into his truck myself." She paused, her expression growing worried. "Are you feeling all right? You look pale." The implications hit Rebecca like a physical blow. If Jake had left yesterday evening, then who had been outside her cabin last night? Who had tried to get into her room? Who had spoken to her through the door in Jake's voice? "I think I need to sit down," Rebecca whispered, sinking into the nearest chair. Martha hurried to bring her a glass of water and sat down beside her. "Tell me what happened, Rebecca. You're frightening me." Through shaking hands and a voice that seemed to belong to someone else, Rebecca recounted the events of the previous night. She told Martha about the footsteps, the sounds at the lock, the voice claiming to be Jake checking on her welfare. As she spoke, she watched Martha's face grow increasingly alarmed. "We need to call the sheriff," Martha said firmly, when Rebecca finished. "Someone was on my property last night who had no business being there, someone who was specifically targeting you." The next few hours passed in a blur of official activity. Sheriff Deputy Linda Rodriguez arrived within 30 minutes, a compact woman in her 40s with intelligent brown eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She took Rebecca's statement with patient thoroughness, asking detailed questions about timing, voices, and physical evidence. "I'd like to examine your cabin before we disturb anything," Deputy Rodriguez said. "Would you be comfortable showing me exactly what happened?" The walk back to cabin 7 felt surreal in the bright morning sunshine. Everything looked so normal, so peaceful, that Rebecca almost doubted her own memories. But when they reached the cabin, Deputy Rodriguez immediately found evidence that validated Rebecca's fears. "Look here," she said, crouching beside the front door and pointing to scratches around the lock mechanism. "These are fresh, made with some kind of metal tool, probably a screwdriver or small pry bar." She stood up and examined the doorframe more closely. "And here, you can see where pressure was applied, trying to force the mechanism." Rebecca stared at the scratches, feeling sick. Someone had definitely tried to break into her cabin. Someone who had spoken to her in Jake Morrison's voice, who had known she was alone and vulnerable. "Did you get a good look at this Jake character during your stay?" Deputy Rodriguez asked as they examined the cabin's perimeter. "Not really. He was forgettable. Medium height, brown hair, ordinary features. The kind of person you'd pass on the street without noticing." Rebecca paused, remembering. But his eyes were different, intense, like he was always studying people. They found more evidence around the cabin. Footprints in the soft earth beneath the windows, broken twigs where someone had moved through the surrounding brush, and cigarette butts that Martha insisted weren't left by lodge staff or previous guests. "I want to check with Portland PD about this Jake Morrison," Deputy Rodriguez said as they headed back to the main lodge. "Get some background information, verify his story about a family emergency." But when she made the call, the news was even more disturbing than Rebecca had feared. "There's no record of a Jake Morrison in Portland matching the description you gave me," Deputy Rodriguez reported. "No family emergency calls to the police department, no hospital admissions, nothing. Either he lied about where he was from, or Jake Morrison isn't his real name." Martha looked stricken. "But I checked his references when I hired him. He had a letter from a resort in Oregon, work history, everything seemed legitimate." "I'd like to see those documents," the deputy said, "and any other information you have about his employment here." What they discovered in Martha's office files was chilling. The reference letter from the Oregon resort was printed on letterhead that looked professional, but contained a phone number that had been disconnected for over a year. The work history was a fabrication. When Deputy Rodriguez called the businesses listed, half of them didn't exist, and the other half had never heard of Jake Morrison. "He systematically deceived us," Martha said, her voice shaking. "Everything about his background was false, and I let him into our lodge, around our guests." The investigation expanded quickly. Deputy Rodriguez contacted the FBI's missing persons database and discovered something that made everyone's blood run cold. In the past 5 years, 3 young women had disappeared from remote lodges and resorts along the Pacific coast. All were traveling alone, all had been staying at locations where a temporary male employee had recently been hired, and all had vanished without a trace. "The descriptions of the employee vary," Deputy Rodriguez explained to Rebecca and Martha. "Different names, different background stories, but similar physical characteristics. Medium height, brown hair, unremarkable features. The kind of person who blends in anywhere." Rebecca felt nauseous as the implications sank in. She had been selected as a target by someone who made a practice of preying on isolated women, Someone who had studied her routine, learned her vulnerabilities, and planned his approach with terrifying precision. "What happened to the other women?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "That's what we're trying to find out. Their cases remain open, but there have been no credible sightings, no evidence of what became of them." Deputy Rodriguez's expression was grim. "You may be the first person to encounter this individual and live to tell about it." The realization that she had somehow escaped a fate that befell 3 other women left Rebecca feeling hollow and grateful in equal measure. She thought about how close she'd come to opening her cabin door the night before, how a moment of trusting impulse could have changed everything. "I need to ask you something difficult," Deputy Rodriguez said gently. "Would you be willing to work with our forensic artist to create a composite sketch and possibly cooperate with federal investigators if they want to interview you about your experience?" Rebecca nodded without hesitation. If her ordeal could help prevent other women from experiencing what those 3 missing travelers had endured, she would do whatever was necessary. The forensic artist arrived that afternoon, a soft-spoken woman named Janet, who had Rebecca close her eyes and walk through every detail of her encounters with the man who called himself Jake. Slowly, painstakingly, a face began to emerge on the sketch pad. Unremarkable in most ways, but with those intense, calculating eyes that had made Rebecca so uncomfortable. "That's him," Rebecca said when Janet showed her the finished sketch. "That's exactly how he looked at me." Deputy Rodriguez studied the image carefully. "I'm going to distribute this to law enforcement agencies up and down the coast. And I want to coordinate with the FBI to see if this matches descriptions from the other missing person cases." As the official investigation took shape around her, Rebecca found herself struggling with an unexpected mixture of emotions. Relief that she had escaped harm, battled with guilt over the women who hadn't been so fortunate. Anger at being targeted and deceived warred with a strange sense of responsibility to ensure this predator was caught. "What should I do now?" she asked Deputy Rodriguez as the afternoon wore on. "I can't go back to my cabin tonight, and I'm not sure I want to stay in the area at all." "I completely understand your desire to leave," the deputy replied, "but I have to be honest with you. As long as this individual is free, you could still be at risk. He knows your name, probably, knows details about your life that he gathered while working here. You might be safer staying in the area for a few days while we pursue immediate leads." The thought of remaining anywhere near Seaside Haven made Rebecca's skin crawl, but she understood the logic. If the man who called himself Jake was still in the area, driving alone on isolated coastal highways might put her in even greater danger. Martha, overcome with guilt about unwittingly hiring a dangerous predator, insisted that Rebecca stay in her own home rather than returning to the lodge. "I have a guest room and Tom will be here too. You'll be perfectly safe and it won't cost you anything. It's the least I can do after what you've been through." That evening, as Rebecca sat in Martha's cozy kitchen sharing a quiet dinner, she found herself thinking about the women who hadn't made it to safety. 3 lives cut short by a man who specialized in exploiting the vulnerability of solo travelers seeking peace and solitude. "I keep thinking about something he said," Rebecca told Martha as they cleaned up the dishes. "When we were on the trail together, he asked if I was running away from something. At the time, it seemed like casual conversation. But now, it feels like he was specifically looking for women who were emotionally vulnerable." Martha nodded, thoughtfully. Predators often have an instinct for identifying people who are going through difficult times. Women traveling alone to remote places are often dealing with some kind of life crisis or emotional pain. The conversation was interrupted by Deputy Rodriguez calling with an update. "I've heard back from the FBI and they're very interested in your case. They want to send an agent up from San Francisco tomorrow to interview you formally. They also think there might be a connection to some unsolved cases beyond the 3 I mentioned earlier. How many cases? Rebecca asked, though she dreaded the answer. Possibly as many as 7 or 8, going back 10 years, all involving women who disappeared from remote accommodations after interacting with temporary male employees who later vanished as well. Rebecca sat down heavily, overwhelmed by the scope of what she had unknowingly become part of. He's been doing this for a decade. It appears so, and you may be our first real break in identifying and catching him. That night, Rebecca lay in Martha's guest room, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the randomness of survival. What had made her different from the other women? Why had her instincts warned her away from danger when theirs hadn't? Was it something in her personality, her life experience, or simply luck? She thought about her failed marriage, about the pain and isolation that had driven her to seek solitude at Seaside Haven. The irony wasn't lost on her that the emotional wounds she'd come here to heal might have been the very things that saved her life. Her recent experience with David's betrayal had left her hyper-vigilant about men who said one thing while meaning another. Her newly developed instinct for deception had been honed by months of living with someone whose words didn't match his actions. In a strange way, her divorce had prepared her to recognize the predatory behavior that other women might have dismissed as awkward flirtation or social anxiety. The pain she'd endured had given her a clarity about danger that might have been the difference between life and death. But that knowledge brought no comfort as she thought about the other women who had trusted when they should have fled, who had dismissed their fears as paranoia, who had opened their doors to monsters wearing friendly masks. Tomorrow, she would talk to federal investigators and add her story to a growing file of evidence. She would help them build a case against a man whose real name they didn't even know. She would do everything in her power to ensure that no other woman would experience the terror she had felt in those dark hours when death might have been footsteps away. As she finally drifted towards sleep, Rebecca found herself thinking about one detail that continued to nag at her. The man who called himself Jake had left the lodge at 6 o'clock yesterday evening, according to Martha. But he had returned sometime after dark to try to break into her cabin. That meant he was still in the area, possibly watching and waiting for another opportunity. The investigation was just beginning, but Rebecca already knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would not rest until this predator was caught and the other women were found. Whatever had happened to them, wherever they were, they deserved justice, and she intended to make sure they got it. FBI Special Agent Catherine Walsh arrived at Seaside Haven the next morning, driving a nondescript sedan and carrying a briefcase that seemed far too small to contain the weight of 7 unsolved disappearances. She was younger than Rebecca had expected, perhaps in her early 40s, with short blonde hair and the kind of focused intensity that suggested years of dealing with humanity's darkest impulses. "Ms. Matthews, thank you for agreeing to speak with us," Agent Walsh said as they settled into Martha's living room. "I know this has been traumatic, but your cooperation could be crucial in solving multiple cases that have gone cold." Rebecca noticed the agent said "us," even though she appeared to be alone, and her question was answered moments later when Agent Walsh opened her briefcase and removed a tablet computer. "I have my partner, Agent Marcus Thompson, joining us virtually from our San Francisco field office. He's been working on these connected cases for 3 years. The tablet screen came to life, revealing a black man in his 50s with graying temples and tired eyes. "Ms. Matthews," Agent Thompson's voice came through clearly, "I can't tell you how important it is that you survived your encounter and are willing to help us. We've been chasing shadows for years, and you're the first person who's been able to give us a detailed description of our suspect." Over the next 2 hours, the agents walked Rebecca through every detail of her experience at Seaside Haven. They asked her to describe not just what happened, but how she felt, what her instincts told her, and what specific behaviors triggered her alarm. Agent Walsh took notes on everything, while Agent Thompson occasionally asked for clarification on timeline details. "You mentioned that he seemed to know personal information about you, specifically about your divorce," Agent Walsh said. "Can you think of any way he might have learned those details?" Rebecca considered the question carefully. "I didn't tell him anything directly, but I was pretty obviously emotional when I arrived. I was traveling alone, staying for an extended period, and I probably looked like someone going through a difficult time. Maybe that was enough for him to make educated guesses. Or maybe he was more thorough in his background research than we initially thought," Agent Thompson said grimly. "Tell me, did you make your reservation online? Use social media to post about your trip? Any digital footprint that might have given him access to personal information?" The questions sent a chill through Rebecca as she realized how much of her life was accessible through online sources. She had made the reservation through the lodge's website, had mentioned needing time to think in her email correspondence with Martha, and had even posted a vague Facebook update about taking a solo retreat before leaving Sacramento. "He could have known quite a bit about my situation before I even arrived," she admitted. Agent Walsh nodded. "We're finding that our suspect puts considerable effort into selecting and researching his targets. This isn't random predatory behavior. It's systematic and planned." "Can you tell me about the other women?" Rebecca asked. "The ones who didn't..." Agent Thompson's expression grew heavy. "7 confirmed cases over the past decade, possibly more that we haven't connected yet. All were traveling alone to remote accommodations, mountain lodges, coastal retreats, wilderness resorts. All had recently experienced major life changes: divorce, job loss, death of a family member, relationship breakups." "How did he find them?" The question came out as barely a whisper. "We think he monitored online forums and social media for women posting about solo travel plans, especially those mentioning emotional difficulties or life transitions," Agent Walsh explained. "Then he would apply for temporary work at their chosen destinations, sometimes weeks or months in advance." The methodical nature of the predator's approach made Rebecca feel sick. She thought about her own online posts, her email correspondence with Martha, the digital trail that had essentially advertised her vulnerability to someone hunting for exactly that type of target. "We'd like to show you some photographs," Agent Thompson said gently. "These are the missing women. I know it's difficult, but we need to know if any of them look familiar, if you might have seen them in posts or forums online." The faces that appeared on the tablet screen were heartbreaking in their ordinary beauty. Young women with bright smiles and hopeful expressions, captured in happier moments before their lives were cut short. Sarah Kim, 26, who had disappeared from a mountain resort in Oregon after her fiancé called off their wedding. Jennifer Walsh, 31, who vanished from a coastal lodge in Washington state following her mother's death from cancer. Maria Santos, 29, who went missing from a wilderness retreat in Northern California after losing her job in tech. They all look so... Rebecca struggled to find the words. "Full of life," Agent Walsh finished. "That's what makes these cases so particularly tragic. These women were seeking healing, trying to rebuild their lives, and instead they encountered pure evil." As the agents continued showing photographs and case details, a disturbing pattern emerged. The predator didn't just target vulnerable women, He specifically sought out those who were intelligent, educated, and financially independent, women who under normal circumstances would be difficult to deceive or manipulate. He seems to prefer victims who represent a challenge, Agent Thompson observed. Women who wouldn't normally fall for obvious predatory behavior. That suggests a high level of sophistication in his manipulation techniques. What happened to them? Rebecca asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. Agent Walsh and Agent Thompson exchanged glances. We don't know, Agent Thompson admitted. In every case, the women simply vanished. No bodies have been recovered, no ransom demands, no credible sightings. It's as if they were erased from existence. The absence of physical evidence was almost more terrifying than finding remains would have been. It suggested a level of planning and organization that went far beyond impulsive violence. There is one thing we haven't shared with the media, Agent Walsh said carefully. In 3 of the cases, family members received postcards several months after the disappearances. The postcards appeared to be from the missing women, claiming they had decided to start new lives and didn't want to be contacted. Rebecca felt hope flicker briefly before Agent Thompson continued. Handwriting analysis proved the postcards were forgeries. Someone was deliberately trying to make the families believe their loved ones had chosen to disappear voluntarily. The cruelty of that deception was staggering. Not only had this predator taken these women, but he had tortured their families with false hope and the suggestion that their daughters had abandoned them by choice. The families, Rebecca said quietly. How are they coping? It varies, Agent Walsh replied. Some have never given up hope. Others have accepted that their loved ones are gone but want answers. A few have been destroyed by the uncertainty. I'd like to meet some of them, Rebecca said impulsively. The families, I mean, if they're willing. The agents looked surprised. That's not typically part of our protocol, Agent Thompson said. It can be emotionally difficult for both survivors and families. I understand, but I feel like I owe them something. I escaped when their daughters didn't. Maybe talking to them would help somehow. After some discussion, the agents agreed to reach out to families who had expressed willingness to speak with investigators or media. 2 families agreed to meet with Rebecca that afternoon, the parents of Sarah Kim and the sister of Maria Santos. Rebecca's first conversation was with David and Linda Kim, Sarah's parents, who drove up from Portland to meet her at a small cafe in the nearest town. They were a reserved couple in their 60s, carrying themselves with the careful dignity of people who had learned to function despite unimaginable loss. Sarah was planning to hike the Pacific Crest Trail after her fiancé broke off their engagement, Linda Kim explained, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. She said she needed time in nature to figure out who she was without him. The mountain lodge was supposed to be a practice retreat before the longer hike. Nurse, she was so strong, David Kim added. Independent, smart, cautious. We keep wondering what we could have told her that might have made a difference. Rebecca found herself sharing details about her own experience that she hadn't even told. The agents, the subtle ways the predator had tested her boundaries, the gradual escalation of threatening behavior disguised as helpfulness, the way he had seemed to study her reactions to calibrate his approach. Your daughter would have been smart and careful too, Rebecca assured them. This man was skilled at exploiting exactly those qualities. He made trust seem like the logical choice when it was actually a trap. The conversation with Maria Santos's sister Elena was even more heartbreaking. Elena was only 2 years older than Maria and bore a strong physical resemblance to her missing sister. Maria was supposed to call me every night during her retreat, Elena said, tears streaming down her face. When she didn't call the first night, I assumed she was tired or had poor cell service. When she didn't call the second night, I knew something was wrong. but by then it was too late. Elena described her sister as brilliant but fragile, someone who felt deeply and needed solitude to process difficult emotions. She'd just been laid off from her dream job at a startup. She felt like a failure, like she needed to figure out how to start over. The retreat was supposed to give her clarity about her next steps. No. Instead, she found a monster who preyed on women exactly like her, Rebecca said softly. As the afternoon wore on, Rebecca began to understand something crucial about the predator's method. He didn't just target vulnerable women. He specifically sought out those whose disappearances would be delayed in being reported. Women who had told friends and family they needed space, who were expected to be out of contact for days or weeks, who had chosen isolated locations specifically to be alone. He gives himself a head start, Rebecca realized during her drive back to Martha's house. By the time anyone realizes something's wrong, he's had days or weeks to cover his tracks. That evening, Agent Walsh called with disturbing news. We ran the composite sketch through facial recognition software and cross-referenced it with known. In criminals, we got a possible match. Rebecca's heart began racing. Who is he? A man named Thomas Mitchell, 42, with a record of assault and stalking charges dating back 15 years. He's from Nevada originally, but he's been living under various false identities for the past decade. The charges were all related to his interactions with women he met through dating apps or social media. So he has a history of targeting women. Yes, but here's the troubling part. Thomas Mitchell was reported dead in a car accident 3 years ago. If our match is correct, either the reports of his death were false or someone else has been using his identity. The implications were staggering. Either they were dealing with a man who had faked his own death to avoid prosecution, or the predator had been using the identity of a dead man. Both possibilities suggested a level of criminal sophistication that made Rebecca's narrow escape seem even more miraculous. There's something else, Agent Walsh continued. We found his last known address and obtained a warrant to search the property. What we discovered there is significant. What did you find? Personal items that appear to belong to some of the missing women. Jewelry, clothing, personal documents. We're running DNA tests to confirm, but it looks like we found physical evidence connecting him to at least 4 of our cases. Rebecca felt a complex mixture of relief and horror. Evidence meant progress toward justice, but it also confirmed that the missing women were almost certainly dead. Are you any closer to finding him? We think so. The property search gave us additional fingerprints and DNA evidence. We've also found financial records that show he's been using multiple fake identities to secure employment at rural hospitality businesses up and down the coast. So he's done this before, in other places. Many times. We think your case might represent his final attempt in this region before moving on to a new hunting ground. The fact that you escaped and can identify him makes this area too dangerous for him to continue operating. That night, Rebecca lay awake thinking about the personal items found in Thomas Mitchell's hiding place. Someone's daughter's jewelry, carefully preserved like trophies. Someone's sister's clothing, kept as reminders of successful hunts. The sick, ritualistic aspect of the crimes made her stomach turn. But along with the revulsion came a growing sense of determination. These women had been reduced to objects in their killer's private collection, their humanity stripped away and forgotten. Someone needed to speak for them, to ensure their stories were told with dignity and respect. The next morning brought unexpected news. Agent Thompson called to inform Rebecca that the investigation had attracted media attention and reporters were beginning to ask questions about her role as a survivor. We can keep your identity confidential if you prefer, he assured her. But some survivors find it helpful to speak publicly about their experiences. It can help other women recognize similar danger signs. Rebecca considered the offer carefully. Speaking publicly would mean reliving her trauma repeatedly, answering invasive questions, and possibly putting herself at risk if the predator was still at large. But it would also mean using her experience to potentially save other women's lives. "I want to think about it," she said finally. "But if it could help catch him or prevent other women from becoming victims, I'm willing to do whatever is necessary." As the investigation continued to unfold around her, Rebecca found herself becoming more than just a witness or victim. She was becoming an advocate for the women who couldn't speak for themselves, a voice for those whose stories had been cut short by violence. The transformation wasn't comfortable or easy. Every conversation about the case forced her to confront how close she had come to joining the ranks of the missing. Every detail about Thomas Mitchell's methods reminded her that survival had been as much about luck as instinct. But gradually, she began to understand that her survival carried responsibilities, as well as relief. She'd been given something the other women hadn't, the chance to ensure their killer faced justice, and she intended to honor that opportunity with everything she had. The breakthrough came exactly 1 week after Rebecca's encounter at Seaside Haven, in a way that no one could have predicted. Agent Walsh called Rebecca at 7 in the morning, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "We got him. Thomas Mitchell is in custody." Rebecca sat up in bed, instantly awake despite the early hour. "How? Where?" "He made a mistake. After your escape, he panicked and tried to retrieve evidence from his property before fleeing the area. Our surveillance team was watching the location and caught him in the act." Agent Walsh paused. "There's more, Rebecca. What we found when we arrested him, it's going to be difficult to hear." "Tell me." "He had detailed files on you and the other women, photographs, personal information, planned approaches. He'd been stalking his victims for months before making contact, learning their routines, their vulnerabilities, their support systems." The revelation that she had been watched and studied for months before arriving at Seaside Haven made Rebecca feel violated in a new way. Her decision to visit the lodge hadn't been spontaneous bad luck. It had been the culmination of a carefully orchestrated plan. "How long had he been watching me?" "Based on the files we found, at least 3 months. He had screenshots of your social media posts about the divorce, copies of emails you sent to friends about needing space, even photographs taken outside your apartment in Sacramento." Rebecca's legs went weak. The man who called himself Jake Morrison had been a shadow in her life long before she knew he existed, collecting information and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Did he plan what happened to the other women the same way? Yes. In some cases, he followed them for over a year before making his move. He was incredibly patient and methodical. Agent Walsh arranged to meet Rebecca at the federal building in San Francisco that afternoon. "We're going to need you to identify him in a lineup, and there are some things we've found that we'd like you to see, only if you're comfortable, of course." The drive to San Francisco felt surreal. Rebecca found herself looking over her shoulder, constantly still unable to fully believe that the predator who had haunted her thoughts was actually in custody. Part of her wondered if this was some kind of elaborate trap, if Thomas Mitchell had somehow orchestrated his own arrest as part of a larger plan. At the federal building, Agent Thompson met her in person for the first time. He was taller than she'd expected from their video calls, with the weathered face of someone who had seen too much human cruelty. "Before we proceed with the identification, I want you to know that Thomas Mitchell has confessed to multiple murders," he said gently. He's agreed to lead us to the locations where he disposed of the victim's remains in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. Rebecca closed her eyes, feeling grief wash over her for women she'd never met, but whose stories had become intertwined with her own. All of them. 7 confirmed victims. He claims there are more, going back further than our investigation reached. Agent Thompson's voice was heavy with fatigue. He's been doing this for 15 years, Rebecca. You were meant to be victim number 8. The lineup was held in a sterile room with one-way glass. Rebecca stood between the 2 agents, staring at 5 men of similar height and build. When her eyes landed on the 3rd man from the left, her body reacted before her mind could process the recognition. Her hands began shaking, her breathing became shallow, and she felt the same primal fear that had driven her to barricade her cabin door. "That's him," she whispered. "Number 3. Thomas Mitchell looked exactly as she remembered. Unremarkable. Features, medium build, the kind of person who could disappear into any crowd. But even through the one-way glass, even knowing he was restrained and surrounded by law enforcement, those calculating eyes still made her skin crawl. "Thank you," Agent Walsh said softly. "That's a positive identification." In the conference room afterward, the agents showed Rebecca some of the evidence they'd recovered from Mitchell's various hiding places. The personal effects were heartbreaking. Jewelry that had once marked special occasions in young women's lives, now reduced to trophies in a killer's collection. But it was the notebooks that truly revealed the depth of Mitchell's depravity. He kept detailed records of each victim, Agent Thompson explained, opening one of the journals. Their personalities, their fears, their emotional vulnerabilities. He studied them like a scientist preparing for an experiment. Rebecca looked at pages covered in neat handwriting that documented Sarah Kim's anxiety about disappointing her. Parents, Jennifer Walsh's grief over her mother's death, Maria Santos's imposter syndrome at work. The level of psychological insight was chilling. How did he learn so much about them? Social media mostly. He created fake profiles to befriend them online, sometimes months before they planned their trips. He would engage them in conversations about their problems, offer sympathy and advice, gradually gathering the information he needed to approach them effectively. The manipulation was more sophisticated than Rebecca had imagined. Mitchell hadn't just stalked his victims physically, he had infiltrated their emotional lives, becoming a trusted confidant before revealing his true nature. "There's something else we need to show you," Agent Walsh said carefully. "Mitchell had a file on you that's extensive." The folder they placed in front of Rebecca contained printouts of every social media post she'd made in the 6 months leading up to her trip, copies of emails she'd sent to friends about her, marital problems, even photographs taken outside her workplace and apartment building. But most disturbing were the handwritten notes analyzing her psychological profile. Subject shows classic signs of emotional vulnerability following marital dissolution, one entry read. Seeks isolation and natural settings for healing, likely to trust authority figures and helping professionals. Strong independence indicates need for gradual approach to avoid triggering flight response. Reading Mitchell's clinical assessment of her personality felt like being dissected while still alive. He had understood her better than she understood herself, had identified exactly which emotional buttons to push to make her compliant. "He planned to keep you alive longer than the others," Agent Thompson said quietly. "His notes indicate he was interested in your photography skills. He thought you might be useful for documenting his activities." The implication made Rebecca physically ill. She had escaped not just death, but something far worse than a quick ending. What happens now? she asked, needing to focus on the future rather than dwelling on what might have been. Mitchell will plead guilty to avoid the death penalty, and he'll serve multiple life sentences without possibility of parole, Agent Walsh explained. More importantly for the families, he's agreed to lead us to the burial sites. They'll finally be able to lay their daughters to rest. Over the following weeks, Rebecca found herself at the center of a media storm she hadn't anticipated. The case attracted national attention as details emerged about Mitchell's 15-year killing spree and the sophisticated methods he used to target and manipulate his victims. Rebecca decided to speak publicly about her experience, despite the emotional toll of reliving her trauma repeatedly. She appeared on news programs, spoke at conferences about personal safety, and worked with advocacy groups to educate women about recognizing predatory behavior online. The scariest thing about Thomas Mitchell wasn't his violence, she told a reporter during one interview. It was how normal he seemed, how skilled he was at making women feel safe when they were actually in terrible danger. He weaponized our natural desire to trust and heal. The families of Mitchell's victims reached out to Rebecca as the investigation concluded. Rather than resentment over her survival, they expressed gratitude that someone had lived to tell their daughters' stories and ensure their killer faced justice. Linda Kim, Sarah's mother, sent Rebecca a letter that brought her to tears. Knowing that Sarah's death meant something, that it helped catch the man who took her, gives us a small measure of peace. Thank you for having the courage to survive and speak for our girls. The recovery of the victims' remains began 3 months after Mitchell's arrest. He led investigators to remote locations across 4 states, places so isolated that the bodies might never have been found without his cooperation. Each recovery brought closure to grieving families, but also revealed new horrors about Mitchell's crimes. Rebecca attended several of the memorial services, finding herself embraced by families who saw her as a connection to their lost daughters. She spoke at Sarah Kim's service about the strength and independence that had made Sarah a target, reframing her vulnerability as evidence of her courage in seeking healing. Sarah came to that mountain retreat because she was brave enough to face her pain and work through it, Rebecca told the assembled mourners. She was everything Thomas Mitchell wasn't: honest, open, willing to trust and hope. He couldn't destroy those qualities even when he destroyed her. The healing process for Rebecca was slow and complicated. Therapy helped her work through the survivor's guilt and trauma, but she struggled with hypervigilance and trust issues that would take years to fully resolve. She moved back to Sacramento, but found herself constantly checking logs, researching background information on service providers, and avoiding isolated locations that reminded her of Seaside Haven. But alongside the trauma came an unexpected sense of purpose. Rebecca became involved with organizations that provided safety resources for solo female travelers, helped develop educational materials about online stalking and manipulation, and worked with law enforcement agencies to improve their response to missing person cases. Something good has to come from this, she told her therapist during one session. 7 women died, but maybe their deaths can prevent others from experiencing the same fate. A year after her encounter with Thomas Mitchell, Rebecca returned to Northern California for the first time since her escape. She didn't go back to Seaside Haven. The lodge had closed permanently after the publicity surrounding the case, but she did visit the memorial garden that the families had created near the town, where several of the victims had been recovered. 7 small plaques honored the women whose lives had been cut short by Mitchell's violence. Sarah Kim, Jennifer Walsh, Maria Santos, and 4 others, whose stories Rebecca had come to know intimately through court proceedings and family conversations. Each plaque included a photograph from happier times and a quote chosen by their families. Rebecca stood before Maria Santos's memorial, reading the inscription Elena had chosen. She believed in second chances and new beginnings. The words seemed to apply as much to Rebecca's own journey as to Maria's truncated dreams. As she prepared to leave the memorial garden, Rebecca noticed a young woman sitting alone on a nearby bench. She was perhaps 25, with the kind of defeated posture that Rebecca recognized from her own darkest days after the divorce. The woman was scrolling through her phone, occasionally wiping away tears. Rebecca approached carefully, not wanting to intrude, but feeling compelled to reach out. "Are you okay?" The young woman looked up, startled. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disturb anyone. I heard about this place online and thought I'd visit. I'm going through a rough time and needed somewhere peaceful to think." Every alarm bell in Rebecca's head began ringing. The woman's explanation was eerily similar to her own motivation for visiting Seaside Haven. A vulnerable person seeking solitude, posting about her location online, making herself visible to predators who specialized in exploiting exactly this type of situation. "I'm Rebecca," she said, sitting down on the bench, "and I think I understand exactly how you're feeling." Over the next hour, Rebecca shared her story with the young woman, whose name was Ashley. She explained about online predators who targeted vulnerable women, about the importance of trusting instincts, about the resources available for people going through difficult transitions. "I was planning to visit this retreat center I found online," Ashley admitted. "It's really remote, which seemed perfect for what I need right now, but after hearing your story..." "Trust your instincts," Rebecca said firmly. "If something feels wrong, it probably is. There are plenty of ways to find healing that don't require isolation or vulnerability." As Ashley left with Rebecca's contact information and a list of safer resources for women seeking emotional support, Rebecca realized that her survival had given her more than just life. It had given her the ability to potentially save others. The encounter reminded her why she continued to speak publicly about her experience despite the emotional cost. Every woman who heard her story and recognized danger signs, every person who learned to trust their instincts instead of dismissing them as paranoia, represented a small victory against the Thomas Mitchells of the world. That evening, Rebecca called Elena Santos to tell her about the encounter at the memorial garden. "Maria would be so proud," Elena said through tears. "She always wanted to help people, to make a difference in the world. Knowing that her memory is still protecting other women, it means everything." As Rebecca drove home to Sacramento, she thought about the strange turns her life had taken. Since that July morning when she first arrived at Seaside Haven, she had come to that remote lodge seeking healing from the pain of a failed marriage, running from emotional wounds that seemed too deep to mend. Instead, she had encountered evil in its purest form and somehow found the strength to survive it. In the process, she had discovered reserves of courage and resilience she never knew she possessed. The broken woman who had checked into Cabin 7 18 months ago barely resembled the advocate and survivor she had become. The healing she had sought in isolation had ultimately come through connection with law enforcement officers, with victims' families, with other survivors, and with women like Ashley who needed guidance and support. Her greatest strength hadn't been her ability to recognize danger, but her willingness to transform her trauma into a tool for protecting others. Thomas Mitchell had chosen his victims carefully, targeting women he perceived as weak and vulnerable. But he had underestimated the power of human resilience, the ability of the human spirit to transform suffering into strength and use personal pain to prevent others from experiencing similar harm. Rebecca Matthews had survived not just to live another day, but to ensure that 7 other women's stories were never forgotten, that their killer faced justice, and that their deaths served as a warning to other potential victims. In the end, the predator who thought he could erase these women from existence had instead ensured that their memory would live on as a force for protection and healing. The last person who saw them would remember, and through that memory they would continue to save lives long after their own had ended. If this story has touched your heart, if you felt the fear and hope alongside Rebecca, please take a moment to engage with our community. Like this video to help us reach other women who might need to hear these important safety reminders. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story that could potentially save a life. And most importantly, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced that gut feeling that something wasn't right? Have you trusted your instincts when they warned you of danger? Your experiences could help someone else. Recognize the signs before it's too late. Remember, speaking up about these difficult topics isn't just about true crime entertainment. It's about creating a community of awareness and protection. Together, we can honor the memories of women like Sarah, Jennifer, and Maria by ensuring their stories continue to serve as warnings and inspiration for others. Stay safe, trust your instincts, and never forget that your survival might be the key to someone else's protection.